everybody, Fran here at New Testament Explained. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. This is what I'm going to call bonus video 10. If you've been watching this series on Anthology 6, you'll know I did it out of 9, but I decided to separate Jesus before Pilate being sentenced. So this is like a bonus video. As with some of the earlier videos, the video 8 and 9 in particular, we are looking at why did Jesus have to die, the reasons why he was eventually crucified, and we're also continuing to look at key themes. The key themes have run across all of the passages that make up Anthology 6. So in terms of the videos so far, what has appeared is evidence that Jesus dying was part of God's plan and that perhaps God was responsible. We had in the last video an inclination that religious authorities have a degree of responsibility due to the trial with the high priest. And now what we get is the third passage where Pilate becomes involved, and therefore we start looking at whether political authorities have responsibility. So Jesus before Pilate shows John's gospel entering its most dramatic phase. As I've kind of just said, the Romans have been in the background so far, sinister force, but in the background, and now they're going to emerge through the representative of Pontius Pilate. And what's quite interesting here is to compare the conversation between Jesus and the high priest and Jesus with Pilate, because they are very different. And if you've not watched my video looking at Jesus and his engagement with the high priest, that is in the previous video, so video 9 in this series. So this is the first section of Jesus before Pilate, and this starts with it being the early morning and the idea that the Jewish leaders didn't want to enter the palace because they wanted to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness and wanted to be able to eat at the Passover. And this kind of brings a sense of irony, really, from the off, that they're worrying about ceremonial uncleanliness, but they are essentially trying to, some would argue, kill the Son of God. So we've got a sense of irony. And again, this kind of passage, if we're looking at responsibility, if we're looking at why did Jesus have to die, there is a sense of religious authorities being involved. What is incredibly interesting is verses 30 to 32, because they really start to bring out the debate between the three sort of main options. Was it political authorities, religious authorities, was it part of God's plan? And all three are sort of mentioned here. So it starts with the religious authorities going, if he were not a criminal, he would not have been handed, we would not have handed him over to you. So that's them saying, we need you to sort of impose the punishment, like we think he's committed a crime, so we're sending him for you to deal with. Which again is quite interesting in terms of responsibility, that they are accusing Jesus, but they are not technically the ones who are going to decide his fate, so to speak. Pilate responds by saying, take him yourself and judge him by your own law. So Pilate's being faced with this option and he seems to be rejecting it and saying, it's not my problem, you need to deal with this yourself, which would suggest maybe it wasn't political authorities. And then they respond again, religious authorities, but we have no right to execute anyone, they objective. So again, you've kind of got this very interesting dialogue between religious authorities and political authorities, where they're trying to decide who should take responsibility for deciding the fate of Jesus. And what seems to come out here is that the religious authorities are the one accusing Jesus of a crime, blasphemy, but what they believe is that Pilate and the political authorities have got to be the ones to sort of see the punishment through. Quite an interesting debate there, therefore. But then verse 32 comes along and goes, this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. At that point, we've got an inclination that almost the two before might be somewhat irrelevant, and that this is part of God's plan. Jesus has said the type of death he's got to die, and therefore what has happened previously is just part of that plan. So verse 30 to 32 are really interesting for looking at responsibility, for looking at why Jesus had to die. So In terms of this passage then carrying on, Pilate went back into the palace, summoned Jesus, and they have like another conversation. Pilate goes, "Are you king of the Jews?" Here you can make an interesting link to topic 1.1, prophecies regarding the Messiah, because Pilate seems to think that Jesus is claiming to be an earthly king, but actually his question's a lot deeper than he perhaps anticipates. What he's actually asking is much deeper than he's probably thinking in his own mind. And then Jesus responds, "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asks, "Or did others talk to you about me?" And then Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew?" So again, it's kind of this, you kind of get an inclination as to the role that Pilate plays here, the fact that Jesus is going, "Do you actually think that, or other people telling you that?" That could give you a bit of a hint as to who is responsible for what's going on. What's interesting here is John's Gospel often uses the word Jew to mean unbeliever, so maybe the last bit where Pilate says, "Am I a Jew?" is maybe asking, "Am I an unbeliever?" instead. So that's quite interesting as well. But again, we've kind of just got this to and thrown at this point. One of the most important phrases I would say in this section is the next one: "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." So what we've got here is inclinations that this is part of God's plan. Jesus is saying if it wasn't, his servants, his maybe disciples, would act to stop this happening. Interestingly, Jesus does attribute and sort of give responsibility for his arrest to religious authorities, but with the section before, he's kind of indicating that whilst he was arrested by Jewish leaders, this is part of a much bigger plan by God. So you might want to sort of look at the sort of links between those two groups when looking at responsibility. At which point Pilate goes, "You are a king then." Again, some people think this is meant to be sarcastic. Jesus is trying to get across that his kingdom is a spiritual realm. You could make links with this quote actually to topic 5.1, which is the kingdom of God. It's in Luke, but you could also look at whether what the kingdom of God's going to be like in John's Gospel. But Pilate has actually said it sarcastically, "You are a king then," but actually he's answered his own question himself. It's quite interesting that he kind of ends on that note. The final bit of interest in this section is Pilate saying, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" Sort of inverted commas. And the crowd say, "No, basically, we want Barabbas." Again, in terms of responsibility, I think you kind of get quite a lot of evidence across these passages where Pilate is trying to avoid the outcome that will be. He doesn't think there's a charge against Jesus. He doesn't think he should be crucified, and therefore there's maybe an indication here that he, as a political authority, cannot be held responsible. And then we kind of got the aftermath of the people saying, "We want Barabbas freed, we don't want Jesus to be freed." Moving on then to the first part of the passage where Jesus is sentenced to be crucified. The soldiers twist together a crown of thorns, put on a purple robe, and kind of mock him, saying, "Hail the King of the Jews," which are quite familiar elements of the crucifixion narrative. What's interesting here is the synoptics do go into more detail than John, but I think the bigger point here is the sense of irony that they are mocking Jesus and kind of dressing him up to be a king and using the thorns, but actually they kind of are dressing him as what he is. So there's a sense of irony there. The big bit in terms of what we're looking at in terms of why does Jesus have to die, verses 4 to 6 again reiterate this notion that Pilate does not think he should be crucified. He says twice, "I find no basis for a charge against him." So you kind of get this build-up of evidence that maybe Pilate can't be held responsible at this point, at least. And what's interesting here is in verse 6, you get, "As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, 'Crucify, crucify.'" So again, you get this interesting sort of situation in John's Gospel in that there are instances where religious authorities seem to be responsible, but running throughout it is also the notion that this is part of God's plan. So it's sort of looking at that relationship between the two potential answers and seeing what you think to be the case. This is the final section then. The first line, there's lots you can talk about. The Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. So firstly, it gives religious authorities a degree of responsibility. They are putting forward their case as to why Jesus should die. It links to the key theme of blasphemy. That is their ultimate problem here. Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, and that's disrespectful. It's an insult on God and therefore blasphemy in their opinion. And thirdly, it links to Christology, that Jesus is making known his relationship with God. So with that one quote, there's a lot you can talk about. Pilate goes on to ask Jesus where he came from, and Jesus refuses to answer. What's interesting here is he doesn't answer in this moment, but one may argue that throughout John's Gospel he does answer this question. You could make a link to the prologue and the idea of the Logos, the idea of the incarnate, and say as early as the prologue, Jesus' identity is, and where he's come from is very clear. You could maybe link it to I am sayings as well in John's Gospel. So there's a few topics you could link it to say that whilst he's not answering the question here, that question has been answered in this Gospel. And then Pilate gets quite defensive and says, don't you realise I have the power to either free you or to crucify you? Which initially indicates that Pilate sees himself as having some responsibility here, that he's going to make the final call. Which is interesting because until this point, we've got the impression that Pilate doesn't have much responsibility, is trying to maybe not see Jesus crucified. But here he does admit that his power, in his opinion, will see him make the final decision, if you like. But Jesus kind of responds to that straight away. First of all, he says, you have no power over me if it was not given to you from above. Here we can infer he's on about the emperor, and you can make a link with the previous quote and the one I've just said to topic 1.2 to Roman occupation, to the fact that Pilate is a Roman governor, but there is an emperor of the Roman Empire, and the notion that maybe Pilate's just a puppet for those higher powers. So that's quite interesting and quite a nice quote you can link to an earlier topic we've studied. But then it ends even more interesting, I would say. Therefore, the one who handed me over is guilty of a greater sin. What he's trying to say here is that whilst Pilate might make the final call, he doesn't actually have genuine responsibility, genuine power because of the Roman occupation context, and that actually the people who should be held responsible and who have committed a greater sin are the religious authorities who've made the accusations. It's quite interesting that we see that in this passage, because there's such an interesting debate here. I would say that you get a lot of inclinations in John's Gospel that it's God's plan and Jesus is part of a broader plan. But here Jesus seems to be suggesting it's religious authorities who have committed the greater sin. So that's quite an interesting quote to look at. Finally, Pilate decides he's going to try and set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders keep shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So we've got the notion, again, that religious authorities are driving this push for crucifixion and perhaps should be considered responsible. But I think we get to a much more significant point, and it's one I've not mentioned yet. It's a theory by Ellis Rivkin, and he says asking who is responsible is the wrong question. It's not the case that we can assign responsibility to either the religious authorities or to the political authorities. The question we should be asking is what is responsible? And the answer to that, in his opinion, is the Roman imperial system, the system in which all of these people operate. And that kind of really comes through in this quote, because the reasoning at this point that the religious authorities seem to be giving is it's all about this imperial system, and if you don't kill someone who's going against Caesar, you are going against Caesar yourself. So it's kind of this notion that the system is the reason we've got to act. So I'd fully recommend reading Ellis Rivkin in more detail, actually. It's a very interesting theory. But I think this final quote really encapsulates how his theory could be considered convincing. if you heard me say on the last slide, it's a final slide. This is a final slide. I just don't want to re-record the last one. So this is the last slide. So at this point, Pilate brings Jesus out, sits down on the judge's seat, and we kind of get the sort of climax of this account. It's a day of preparation of the Passover. It's about noon. So again, you can always talk about context there. It can link it to sort of 1.2, world of the first century, and the fact that many Jews would go to the temple. There will be a lot of pilgrims in Jerusalem at this time. Again, it's noon, so it's midday. People would have been out. So Pilate, again, here is your king, again, a sense of detachment. And we get this notion of religious authorities in particular sort of saying this crucifixion needs to happen. We have no king but Caesar. Crucify him, is what the chief priest says. The we have no king but Caesar is really interesting. They've almost denied God in that, like the only king we have is Caesar. You can sort of link it to Rifkin's idea of the Roman imperial system being responsible here rather than an individual. But it's quite interesting that they say that in this passage, at least. Whether they did say it or not may be debatable. You can link it to 1.2. Again, we have no king but Caesar. You can link it to Roman occupation, the nature of the emperor's power. That would be fine. But I think you can also make sort of deeper statements about the significance of the chief priest saying that. And finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. That's highlighted because technically Pilate is the one who hands him over to be crucified. Some may say at that point he must be held responsible. He is the one who makes the final call. But again, looking at all of this video and previous videos collectively, there is evidently an intense debate here as to who is responsible, whether it's Pilate, whether it's religious authorities, the high priest, whether it's God, it's part of God's plan, or whether it's just the Roman imperial system more broadly. So you'll see here why there are debates. You'll see why there are AO2 questions here, because there are so many directions you can look at this from, and therefore what you need to be confident of is how you understand all these factors and who you think or what you think is responsible. But yes, that is the analysis over at this point. Thank you for watching. This has been a rather long video compared to my usual ones, which are around 10 minutes, but it's such an important passage and there is so much to talk about, and the potential not only for a clarified question, but also for broader AO2 questions, assess and analyse questions, make this passage really important for helping you to work out who you think is responsible or what was responsible for Jesus dying and ultimately why Jesus had to die. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and that's all from me.